This introductory lecture is going to cover tissues, which is in chapter 4 of your textbook. For this lab specifically, we're going to talk about tissues in general, organizational system, where we've talked about molecules and cells, and now we're moving up to tissues. And then I'll be introducing the 4 types of tissues to you. So we'll look at the epithelial and the connective tissue, and we'll look briefly at muscle and nervous tissue. These are 2 tissues that we'll cover as we get into like the muscular system and the nervous system in more detail. So most of our information today will be on the epithelial and connective tissues. So in general, tissues are when we have multiple cells coming together, and those cells are going to adhere or stick to one another, and they're going to perform a common function. And so this is now where, if you remember, the plasma membrane is really critical for allowing cells to make connections with each other. This is why. Cells often do not work alone. Rather, similar cells come together to create a tissue. And we'll be looking today at the 4 primary types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And really today our entire lecture covers histology, or the study of tissues. There are many scientists who can quickly look at a micrograph like this one here on the right and very quickly identify the tissue type, but also know if there are issues and disease states of that tissue type. So we're kind of introducing you to the study of histology today. So let's actually get into the 4 types of tissue that we see. So epithelial tissue, this is one of the kind of tissues that we actually, in a way, interact with the most. There are lots of different types of epithelial tissue as shown in this figure here on the right, but they do all, despite all of these differences, they have some shared characteristics. For instance, epithelial tissue will always be found on our free surfaces. So these are going to be found on any surface that's exposed to our external environment. So think your skin, the lining of your mouth, your throat, your entire digestive tract, all the way to your colon and anus is all lined by different types of epithelial tissue, because these are really great tissues at creating a barrier to prevent the loss or entrance of fluids or pathogens and things like that. Another shared characteristic that we will see as we look at these different tissues is they all have a basement membrane. So basically what that means is that we're going to see that we have layers of epithelial tissue, and then underneath that they have this basement membrane. And that membrane is responsible for binding those epithelial cells to the connective tissue that lies below. So you'll see this especially in your integument lab, where you have layers of epithelial tissue that are then connected to connective tissue via that basement membrane. But largely, you can see again from this figure that there are many different types of epithelial tissue, and they are typically classified by both the number of layers that we find in that tissue and also the shape of the cells themselves. So there's really 2 classifications based on the number of layers, and that is simple or stratified. So some examples here, if you look on the left-hand side of this figure, all of these are considered simple layers because there is only 1 layer of cells. So this is 1 layer. Whereas stratified, we see that there are many layers. So for example, for simple cuboidal here, we can see that there's 1 layer of blue cells. But if we compared that to stratified cuboidal here on the right, we can see that there are multiple layers. There's a layer here and a layer here. So we see 2 layers in this example, for instance. So we can classify based on how many layers are there. Is there 1 layer? Great, that's a simple epithelium. Are there many layers? Great, that's a stratified epithelium. An example of an epithelium that's very stratified is our skin, for example. So this picture here is showing kind of a cross section of our skin, and we have many layers of dead cells that actually help protect our body. So we would have a stratified epithelium that makes up our skin. So we can classify based on how many layers of cells there are. We can also classify based on cell shape. And there are three shapes that cells can have in epithelial tissue. They can be squamous or squished. So just think SQ for squished. And we can see this on the top blue, where our squamous cells, they kind of just look irregular in shape. They look kind of squishy and all different shapes that you can see here. Cells can also be cuboidal of this figure here. So notice that in a cuboidal and their width, so we have cube-shaped cells that make up our cuboidal. And then we have finally columnar, which look like columns. They are taller than they are wide. They don't have to be super dramatic in terms of how stretched out they are. Notice on the left-hand side, we have these really tall cells. But on the right-hand side, they're not as stretched out, but they're still taller than they are wide. So we can have squishy cells, our squamous cells, square-shaped, cuboidal, and rectangular-shaped columnar. And again, we can also classify based on how many layers we find in that epithelial tissue. So again, we have a lot of different types of epithelia, but their functions, there's really just three. So the main functions that epithelial tissues perform is protection. So these tissues are really great. They create watertight barriers, so they make sure that nothing can enter and nothing can leave that's not allowed. They can also secrete substances. So for example, our skin can secrete sebum or oil, which can help moisturize our skin or can cause acne, which is kind of the dreaded symptom that every teenager has. Epithelial tissues can also aid in absorption. So there's many topical medicines that we put on our skin that can then be absorbed. We put lotion on our skin as well, and that gets absorbed kind of throughout the day. I also just wanted to highlight table 4.1 from your textbook. I think this nicely gives you kind of a review of epithelial tissue. You're going to see that in your tissue virtual lab, you have a 30-minute video to watch on tissues, and it's going to go through basically all the different types and what they do and where you'll find them. And I think using this table can really help with that virtual lab, so kind of keep that in mind. But really, all of these are working to protect, secrete, and absorb materials. Before we move on to our next tissue type, I do want to highlight that epithelial tissues are also capable of making kind of specialized structures. Specifically, those structures are called glands. And remember that one of the functions of epithelial tissue is to secrete products. And that typically is performed by the glands. There are two types of glands that we will see kind of throughout our integument, specifically your integument virtual lab about the skin. And those are exocrine and endocrine. And they're named based on how they secrete their products. Exocrine glands, like the gland we see in this top figure here, these secrete their substance into a physical duct that leads to the surface of the body or a cavity or an organ. So in this situation, notice that we have these red. So here's our gland, and this gland is going to secrete its products into this duct. And that duct, in the case of our skin, actually leads to our hair follicle, So we can directly secrete, like say, oil onto our hair follicle, which can help maintain the health of that hair follicle. Again, that can cause irritation, which causes acne in some cases, but this would be considered an exocrine gland. And you can kind of think that, remember, exo with exocytosis means exit. So you can think that these glands are secreting something that's going to exit the body or exit the place from which it came. Endocrine glands are different, and those are shown here on the bottom in this bottom figure. Endocrine glands, they're going to secrete their substance kind of just directly outside of the cell. So for instance, if we had a secreting cell here, that endocrine gland, rather than deposit its substance in a duct that then goes somewhere, they kind of just use exocytosis to secrete those products outside of the cell. And then those products can be taken up maybe by a blood vessel, which can then kind of move those targets elsewhere. But there are no ducts in endocrine glands. So that's kind of the big difference, duct versus no duct. So epithelial tissues, we have lots of different types. They can be classified based on how many layers and also their shape. Their main jobs are to protect, secrete, and absorb. In specialized and specifically the secretion function, we have glands which make a product and then secrete that either into a duct that leaves the body or just kind of directly outside of the cell. The next type of tissue I'd like to look at is connective tissue. And connective tissue is truly kind of the most diverse tissue type that we will find in the body. And your virtual lab on tissues goes into really a lot of detail about this. And you'll learn kind of more about each type of connective tissue. So I just want to kind of keep this as more of an overview for you guys. So if you look at this figure here, we have two categories of connective tissue. Connective tissue proper here on the left and specialized connective tissue. Connective tissue proper is really kind of what its name suggests, is that it's tissue that works to kind of connect other tissues together. And there's three types that we find here: areolar, adipose, and dense connective tissue. The specialized connective tissues are kind of what you wouldn't necessarily think of as being connective. And that's our cartilage and our bone, but also kind of the most funky one is our blood. So our blood is actually considered a connective tissue because it connects via our red blood cells, kind of our immune, our circulatory system, and basically all of the cells in our body. While these guys are so diverse, they do have a common role, and that really is to bind or glue other tissues together. So they all basically aid in connection between different cell types. But again, there are specialized versions that help with transport, and that's specifically the blood. So let's look at some commonalities between all of these different connective tissues. So the main reason that all of these different tissue types fall under connective tissue is because all of these contain cells which are embedded in what is called a matrix. So if you notice in these, both in the micrographs or the microscope pictures and the diagrams, there's the cells within each type of connective tissue are very specialized. So for instance, we have areolar connective tissue, and the cells of which are just kind of these small purple ovals that we see here in the diagram. In adipose tissues, the cells look very different. They're these large, big structures here, and they literally just store fat, which is why they look so big and kind of chunky. And then dense connective tissue, the cells of which are shown kind of here, make these long fibers that are fairly regularly organized and dense looking. In cartilage, we have cells that are kind of embedded here in this more kind of pink background. In bone, we have cells that look like kind of little stars that we see here in red. And in blood, we have cells that are floating in kind of a more fluid matrix. But in all of these, we have a specialized cell type embedded in some type of matrix. Typically, that matrix is made of fibers and non-cellular material, which are collectively called the ground substance. The ground substance, so kind of the background that we see in these diagrams, can be either solid, gelatinous, or fluid. So for example, in areolar connective tissue, we have ground substance, kind of the stuff that's shaded in pink. And it's fairly loose, so it's not gelatinous or solid, it's kind of in between. And so it's kind of this loose connection that we see fibers, which are purple, kind of floating through. But if we compared that matrix to, say, cartilage or bone, the matrix of these is much harder. So the matrix in cartilage is more gelatinous, whereas bone, it's very, very solid. And then blood is really the biggest example where you have a fluid matrix, where again, our red blood cells are really floating in what is called plasma. It's in a fluid situation. Throughout all of these different types of fibers, and it's most easily seen in areolar and our dense tissue, we can see kind of these purple fibers running all through that tissue. There's actually lots of different fibers that are 3 different types of fibers that we can find that make up the matrix. There are collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. All 3 work to strengthen that matrix, but they each do a slightly different job. So different tissues will have different fibers and in different amounts to kind of make either a very fluid or a very stiff matrix. It just kind of depends on the tissue. Again, your virtual lab is going to really review the connective tissues in detail. And I just want to highlight table 4.2 from your textbook, as this really will help you kind of keep those 6 connective tissue types more organized as you go through that lab video. I also want to highlight too, so again, this video is fairly short because the majority of this information is going to be covered in Lab 3A for you. I've made a worksheet that can help you as well as with Lab 3A, where they're going to really break down the epithelial and connective tissue in detail in the video that's embedded in Lab 3A. And you can use these notes as well as that worksheet to help you keep track of that information. So just kind of keep that in mind. You're going to get a lot of this from Lab 3A. So we have epithelial tissue, we have connective tissue. Again, epithelial tissue is going to be found on any surface that is exposed to the outside environment. Connective tissue is really found, so we have a lot of connective tissue, for example, right underneath our epithelial tissue, but we have it in our bones, our blood, our cartilage, so it's really found throughout the body, really all over, and it's very predominant in our bodies. So the next 2 types of tissue that we're going to talk about, muscle and nervous, we're going to dive into in a lot more detail as we get into these organ systems. But muscle tissue, again, because we have types of cells coming together, the cells that make up muscle tissue are muscle cells. We're going to talk a lot about the specialization of these cells as we get into the muscular system. But muscle cells come together to create 3 types of muscle, and that's skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal muscle is seen on the top right of this figure here. That is what you think of when you think of muscle. So think like your biceps, your quads, your glutes, all of those muscles. Those are muscles that are physically connected to your skeleton. So when these muscle cells contract, they're going to move your skeleton. And that's a key feature of muscle cells, is that these guys are designed to contract when they are stimulated. We'll talk about how they get stimulated when we get there into the muscles. So skeletal muscle is really found throughout the body. Cardiac muscle is found only in your heart. So this is specialized. It looks somewhat similar to skeletal muscle, but it behaves fairly different. And it's designed specifically to contract involuntarily, so you don't have to think about your heart beating. It does it on its own. And then smooth muscle is found typically in your organs, like in your digestive system and things like that. This is also an involuntary muscle. You don't have conscious control over its contraction. But basically, its job is to aid in digestion. So when you eat a big meal, you have smooth muscle that pushes your food down your throat into your stomach. You have smooth muscle in your stomach that kind of churns up your stomach acid and gets everything digested. Then that moves into your intestine. Smooth muscle works there to further digest and push food towards your colon. And then smooth muscle in your colon works for you to expel any waste. So again, cardiac and smooth muscle are involuntary, meaning you don't have conscious control over these. Whereas skeletal muscle, we will learn about, is voluntary. You can consciously control your arm or your leg to flex, for example. But again, we have muscle cells working together in these three types of muscle tissue. Their common feature is that they contract when stimulated. And then finally, our nervous tissue, which we'll talk a lot about when we're in the nervous system. This makes up our brain, spinal cord, and nerves, and those are kind of highlighted in this figure to the right here. Remember, we have cells working together to create this tissue, and there's two types of cells that we'll talk about. Those are the neurons. These are what you think of when you think of a nerve cell being able to send a signal and transmit that signal. And then we have neuroglia, which are cells that basically keep the neurons healthy and support those cells. The neurons specifically are designed to transmit and receive signals in the body. So this is how we know that we've just touched a hot stove and can make a decision to move our arm away from that temperature. Or, oh, we see something dangerous, I need to react and get out of the way. Or I need to stimulate a gland to release a hormone in the body. Nerves are really responsible for transmitting and receiving signals about our environment so that we can react to our environment. And that's really important. We need to be constantly monitoring and adapting and reacting to our environment. Our body needs to be changing in ways that allow us to respond in a healthy way to our environment, and nervous tissue is really responsible for doing that. So that is a kind of quick and dirty breakdown of the 4 tissue types that are described in chapter 4. And again, you're going to dive more into this in lab 3A, and you can use that worksheet I've given you on D12 to help you with that.